Hey y'all, welcome. ZLS 026. I got a very special guest here. Very excited to have you. Mike Ryan. How you doing, man?
Hello. How are y'all doing?
We're doing great. We're doing amazing. I don't think we have any people in chat yet, but they'll come. So Mike, we were talking with Brandon. We had Brandon on last Friday. This was perhaps the most exciting little piece of information I got from Brandon, was that y'all were working on the American Army video game.
Yes, that is true. That's where Brandon and I first met, and a lot of NgRx got developed while we were working on the social media, like web application for America's Army.
Okay, so that's the origin of NgRx.
Yeah, basically,
Crazy.
Brandon and I had a lot of R&D time in that role. You can kind of think of like the studio that makes America's Army as almost being like the R&D for marketing for the Army.
Okay.
And Brandon and I were bouncing between frameworks. We had a lot of problems with a previous project around state specifically. And we landed on these ideas of immutability and reactivity. And we really wanted to contribute and create an architecture to support this. This was before any of the two was fully released. We found Rob Wormald working in the same space.
Okay.
He had just made the NgRx organization on GitHub, and I think we had like pull request number 2 to the store to like bring a lot of our ideas into it. So that's how it all started.
Very nice. Very nice. So when y'all came at it, where was it at? Like where the pull request number 1, what did it look like at that point? Was it just pretty much Redux, or?
It was Redux-esque. It was actually perhaps more RxJS than what it is currently. Like it was really pushing it to the limits how much of this could we do with RxJS. It was just the store. It didn't have any select APIs. It didn't have no effects, nothing like that. Just a store with reducers and an action interface. So I think our first pull request was adding store DevTools support. I think it was the first big contribution we made.
Well, was type safety already a big thing?
Or was that something else? To the best of our ability. Back then, this is very, very early for TypeScript too, in terms of its community adoption. And so it was very hard to make a type-safe Redux application back in those days. And so as type-safe as possible, but I think if you were to look at that version today, you would say, no, this was not type-safe.
Nice. Well, I mean, that's one of the things I appreciate most about NgRx is everything's like type safe. It makes it a really good developer experience for the users.
I appreciate that. That's been probably the biggest source of change to NgRx's API, or for the store specifically. All of its APIs have really evolved over the past few years to match. Hey, we can now, if we write the code this way, we can actually make it all type safe now. And so.
Alex comes in when we mention type safe. There he is. Hey, Alex. Thanks for coming by, man. So we were talking before the show a little bit. I'm a huge RxJS guy, so where I would have gone would have been like your state would have just been this one observable. And you define it by having probably this mega operator on top of it that just like scan everything, scan all the things. And so I've not dug into the source code on this level, but my mental model of what y'all did with the NgRx API is you have, well, now as of 8 we have create reducer, and what that's going to do is essentially take that scan that I had in my mind, but instead of having it in this like weird RxJS operator, it's just a pure function that says, here's the current state, here's your actions, here's your next state. And so behind the scenes, NgRx is kind of scanning for you. Is that?
Yep. Okay. We use the scan operator underneath the hood, in fact.
Okay. So, I wasn't sure actually if y'all use scan operator or like a behavior subject. So.
We use both for some interesting reasons. But yeah, underneath the hood, there is a state observable, and then we actually merge 2 observables together. We take the actions one, which I think would make some sense that there's a stream of actions involved underneath the hood there. There's also an observable of the reducer function. So in pure Redux, there's only ever one reducer, your root reducer function.
Right.
And whenever you do something like store module.for feature, or you use the reducer manager to register reducers, underneath the hood, we're compiling those into a single reducer function and pushing that through a reducer observable. So that's the three streams we've got going on. We merge them together and we use the scan operator, and we take last state, most recent action, and the most recent reducer, and we compute the next state from that information.
Gotcha. Makes sense. So, and when I had Brandon on, I geek out philosophically sometimes, and so this is one of the big things. One of the main reasons I wanted to get you on was talking about good action hygiene.
For sure.
When I heard that talk, y'all had like a talks. I think it must have been like NgConf.
Yeah.
And Brandon, it's a funny story actually. Brandon woke up my wife with one of the talks. I was like laying down. She was asleep. I was like laying in bed with my laptop, and I couldn't hear y'all very well, so I had like the volume turned up. And then Brandon starts yelling, "Boilerplate!"
Yes.
And my wife was like, "What the hell is that?" So that's my story. Before I even knew y'all, Brandon woke up my wife.
That's fantastic. Alex, who's in the chat, has a great GIF, in fact, of Brandon yelling boilerplate that I use regularly. That he's compiled for us.
I think Brandon's using it on his stream as like his like we'll get started soon. It's just him yelling boilerplate. So yeah,
that was back in the day where to make a type safe NgRx application, you had to write a ton of genuine boilerplate to get it all to be as type safe as possible. But now with create reducer, create action, and the new language support in TypeScript, all of that's gone, and I don't hear the boilerplate complaint nearly as much in 2020 like I used to in 2018.
Yeah, well, I think especially like as soon as Angular 8 came out, I wanted to get into this later. So maybe we'll just put a pause on that. Could you maybe talk about like give a quick synopsis of good action hygiene, and let's take it from there.
So for those of you who are not familiar with NgRx, let me just kind of explain the role of an action real quick to give some context. In just looking at NgRx store, I'm going to put aside effects for a second. With the store, you want to manage some piece of state. And the way you do that is you write these functions called reducer functions, and they can respond to these events that we call actions to create new states. I think when everyone first writes their first Redux style application, they end up following kind of a more of imperative model when defining their actions. It's something that we call a command-driven pattern, where let's say I have a reducer that manages a list of books, and the user does something, and the result of that something is that we want to add a book to the state. Well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write an action that's like add book to state, very command oriented. And that's a good place to get started with the pattern. But what Brandon and I learned after supporting applications like that for a couple of years is that, in my opinion, all you're doing is rebuilding services, but you're making it harder to call your service. Instead of having a service with methods on it, you have created a bunch of code where you've got reducers, and you can call parts of a reducer by dispatching this specially named action. And you're not gaining a lot of benefits of a property called indirection, which is your ability to write code in one place without knowing much about how code the other place works. So in that example of, hey, the user's done something, I'm going to dispatch an action to add a book to the store. Well, that means that that component has to know how the store operates, which actions to call. And that's very confusing, and it's hard for developers to keep that all in their head. And it adds a lot of complexity to the code as well, because then you have components that are like dispatching tons and tons and tons of actions, tons of mess in other places. So good action hygiene is the response to this problem, and it inverts the pattern a little bit. It's basically at a high level, when the user does something unique, write an action to describe that unique interaction, that unique event, something that the user has done. The component dispatches that and has no idea what's going to happen to it. It's up to the reducers and the effects to decide which actions from there they want to listen to. So it's a subtle difference but it goes a long way in terms of how we build applications. It lets developers write components, containers, dispatch actions, and have no idea how the reducers work. Lets developers write reducers that have to touch component behavior. It lets you have really good logs of actions where you can see at a glance all of the events that are occurring in your application and actually know where they're coming from. So it's yeah, I'll kind of put a pause in there, pause on that right there, and we can dig in from more. But yeah, that's the idea, is dispatching actions as events as a way for productivity.
Yeah, switching the mental model from, or just understanding, the difference between a command-based action and an event-based action. Alex said in the chat here that actions as events guidance was life-changing moment. That's very much what I felt when I heard that's your talk, but it didn't come out. It wasn't like a life-changing good moment the first time I heard it. It was a lot of ego saying this was my way of doing things. I was definitely guilty of doing what you were talking about, and so I was like, no, this is right. But then like listening to you bring out your points, and especially thinking of things in terms of planning out your app. I think that was the big thing for me that got me thinking about things, seeing your point, seeing the light, I guess. So you had a section of that talk where you were talking about when you plan out your apps, just start with your actions. Like, what are the events that should happen in this app? Don't even think about what they should do yet. Just what are the events that should happen, and start there, and that's it. And the amazing thing is your components, for the most part, they only need to know, they don't just need to kind of send them off and do them. And then you can kind of have this other, it's almost like you're custom building your own API with NgRx at that point, where you're saying the API is the app, I guess. So.
Yeah, there's this really great activity you can do. It's a common facilitation activity outside of software engineering called event storming, where essentially you get together with your team up front at the beginning of a feature, you get a bunch of sticky notes out, and you just try and describe who are the actors in my system and what things are they going to do. When I say actors, obviously the user's one. What are all the buttons and things are going to do on a page? But also your API is another actor. Yeah. How is it going to respond when I call this API? Well, those different response codes, and what do those mean?
Not just your API, but like your the whole system. Right,
yeah.
like it
could
be multiple APIs, or WebSockets, same thing. It's
browser APIs, tons of things,
But just getting in those events as into that action stream. So I was talking with Brandon. I think one of the most powerful things about what NgRx gives you too out of the box is that actions observable that comes in through effects. I maybe use it more than I should. I'll drop that.
I don't believe that. You can't overuse that.
Well, I'm glad I got your affirmation on this. I always feel a little guilty about it. I've heard other people say you should only use it in effects. I don't know.
Occasionally a use case where you might want to inject it into a component, and it's
modals especially. I feel like it's super
that's helpful. Always the one that I point to. Is like there's unusual cases where it actually makes a little bit of sense. And it's interesting to see developers react strongly against it. Like, whoa, you can't inject the action service there. I'm like, why not? It's just an Angular service. You can inject it anywhere.
Yeah. Well, it's cool to hear you say that. But the other thing that I think I rely on too, and this may be a problem, I'd be very interested to hear your feedback on this one. Sometimes I will refrain from putting some properties in the store based instead on knowing about certain, like the stream of actions that come through. So like rather than on occasion, rather than putting like a loaded Boolean or some property in the store that way, I will just say, well, I'll just be able to determine that from the action stream. So I don't need that. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's overuse of it or not, but
there might be a case that's okay. For me, it sounds like you're kind of you're implementing some of the same logic that you might expect to see in a reducer in terms of, hey, I have this state change, and when these actions come through, it needs to flip. I would probably recommend putting that in a reducer, but if you have code that's working for you and using the action stream, I think that's totally cool too.
Cool. Well, good to know. Typically, oh, Alex. Well, we'll fight later, Alex.
But no, I think that's kind of what I think Alex would agree is like if you're using the action stream to manage local state in your component, maybe that's a little unusual. But if you're trying to set up a stream that needs to respond to the actions in some way, I think there are definitely corner cases. Don't do it too much, but there are corner cases where it makes sense.
Sounds good. Yeah, a friend of mine wrote an article about effects too. Typically effects will start from the action stream and you'll use the of type. I think that's the majority of effects, but I think I use it a lot where I just use any old observable and start with that and map that to something else and pipe it in. So I'll use that in places. Sometimes I'll just put the router in there. Some events on the router, filter them out and do it that way when I'm not using router store. So. But yeah, y'all have everything now. It seems like so. Yeah, I'm trying to think where I wanted to go with this, but maybe bridging from this. One thing I've heard often about NgRx, like a complaint against it, maybe a reason not to use it, is it's so complicated. Is the word that gets used. It is. I actually supremely disagree with that.
Oh, interesting. Then you might disagree a little bit. I'm interested to hear.
Well, that's cool. I see kind of there's two dimensions that often get flattened into one when you talk about difficulty and complexity. I think difficulty and complexity are actually two, like almost an X and a Y axis. If you think about like. I don't know what the larger picture would be, but they're two different dimensions to something. I think when you think of NgRx, it is a difficult pattern to learn for someone who's not familiar with Redux, especially. But it is something that you're able to bridge this gap. There's a distance from you and understanding what NgRx or what Redux is at some starting point, but you can move yourself from that point over to where you understand. Okay, now I understand what NgRx is. It's not a problem anymore. I think simple and complex, maybe simple being on the bottom and complex being on the top, is not a bridge as humans we can easily gap. It's something that's just kind of there. You can't get any closer to that. Maybe some people are naturally better at kind of juggling more threads in their head than others, but I think that's kind of where I go. There's easy and difficult, and there's simple and complex. And I think NgRx is very much on the simple side of that. If you break it down to the components, actions are essentially objects or essentially data. Reducers are a pure function that take 2 parameters, and selectors are a pure function that take 1 parameter. And effects kind of are this separate thing on top of that, but that's in its own package. Just look at store. That's all it is. I think that's supremely simple, actually. Like it's very easy to hold, for me at least, to hold those things in my head. And it wasn't at first when I first encountered NgRx. NgRx was my introduction to Redux, but once the pattern was made familiar, once I bridged that gap, I feel like it made things a lot easier. The speed went up. My understanding was quicker. I don't know. All those good things happened. So that's kind of where I'm at.
I think it's a really interesting way to frame it, and I think I would agree with you. If you were to look at it as difficulty and complex as being separate, then my initial reaction is that NgRx is difficult to learn. Not just because the Redux pattern is hard, but also if you throw in NgRx effects, it also demands an understanding of RxJS too. And neither of those are easy to learn, I don't think.
Yeah, I actually think RxJS is very much the same, a similar situation where it's very difficult to understand everything. Like everything about observables, hot, colds, operators, all that stuff, multicasting. But once you can, if it's a gap you can bridge, and once you get that, you're able to write much more simple code.
Yes.
So
I agree with you completely there. There's actually there's a talk I gave last year called Managing Complexity with NgRx. And I referenced this paper called Out of the Tar Pit by Ben Mosley and Peter Marks. And the paper is basically like, complexity is the hardest thing about building large-scale software.
Yes.
And the paper identifies that the contributors to complexity are state, code volume, and control flow. And it's like, when you look at what NgRx does for an Angular application, it really helps you manage state and complex control flow. You pay for it with a little bit of code volume, but like, and the ergonomics of the reducer and of effects in terms of being able to manage state and control flow are, I mean, they're all, to me, they're really great. They're
can you define control flow a little bit?
Yeah, so like an example would be like let's take a user's journey to the app. Let's say that you're a user and you're looking at a list of items and you want to delete an item, and then your app prompts the user to confirm whether or not they want to delete it, and then you hit confirm, and then you have to reach out to the API and try and delete it, and if that fails, you want to show a message to them. All those little steps that your app had to do in terms of presenting that interaction of that delete button, showing them the prompt, reaching out to the API, handling any errors, that's control flow to me.
Okay.
Basically, and modeling that kind of stuff with effects, it's killer in my opinion. It's to me, effects are like the best part of NgRx. Getting to model all of that with observables and really leveraging RxJS to handle that control flow.
Did you ever at any point consider a different API for effects than the one we have now? So the one we have now is essentially an observable of any kind that's going to return an action, or it's only going to emit actions rather. And then the NgRx API, what it does behind the scenes, my understanding, is it just subscribes to that observable, and whenever an action is emitted, it dispatches that action for you.
Yep.
So this was a problem I was thinking about when doing forms. So I don't know if I'm gonna imagine you haven't seen any of the stuff I've done on this yet, but the API I've kind of put forward has you would define like a value operator, which would just it would be any observable, and the idea is it would start with a value determined by the DOM, an observable of a value as determined by the DOM. And then you would define this is how that value changes reactively as you know, a part of any other factors as would be brought in by the operator. And it feels like when I'm thinking about this problem, I'm trying to think, is there a better way of doing this that's not so heavily reliant on RxJS? Like, I could potentially have like, we could have some number of sources, and each one of those sources we could do some pure function based off that's going to adjust the value whenever those things happen. So it's kind of, I mean, I feel like this is a problem that a lot of frameworks actually have, is where they're trying to figure out how do I do change detection, how do I do state. You can either go with RxJS and kind of define things declaratively, or you can go through and kind of make your own API to kind of say this is how that state's going to change.
In terms of how we model the API, I would say that DI, dependency injection, is our biggest limit, because I think you're kind of hitting on this with your forms example. Really, most of both NgRx store and NgRx effects, if we didn't have to worry about dependency injection at all, we can model a lot of this stuff as just operators, observable in, observable out. The store is an observable of actions in and an observable of state back out. Effects are actually just an observable of actions in and a new observable of actions back out. And so I think if there was not the need for dependency injection for us to do a lot of this with classes to be able to have a nice DI experience, an NgRx freed from that limitation would look a lot more like a collection of operators than a collection of services that you inject.
Interesting. Cool. Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear you say that. Do you feel like so you can kind of get around DI in Angular sometimes? Like I see sometimes DI get overused a little bit, in my opinion, where you kind of wrap these pure functions into a service. It seems like the main benefit of that is kind of discoverability, right?
Yeah.
Like there's the service that exists in our app. Let's use it to call this method. When really that method could just be a simple function that just exists in TypeScript somewhere, and you just import it. So,
yes, I imagine that there's a future Angular in which DI is completely optional, where you can just import symbols from a module, and then write more of this as pure functions. I think actually like a very early version of effects, before it got merged into the NgRx project, tried to do this, where it was just functions that got called, and you would say, here are all the symbols that it needs, and NgRx behind the scenes to try and wire it all up together for you. But it doesn't have the right ergonomics for Angular developers. Angular developers think in services. They want access to DI. In fact, one of the big complaints you hear about NgRx, even after we've made all these conceits to sort of this grander vision, is that other state management libraries feel more Angular because they're relying more heavily on DI and services and decorators. So it's tricky. Yeah, I agree with you. And in a world where we're writing in an NgRx app, you write so much pure code that it'd be so much nicer if we could actually write just functions for a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, so one thing I think about NgRx too, I hear a lot of people say you got to learn RxJS before you learn NgRx. I didn't. I went the other way around. I felt like that was actually a lot simpler. Like I was familiar with RxJS, but just in the sense of like, okay, this is how you use the HTTP client, or kind of just like subscribing to set properties. NgRx was a great introduction to that, I think, because I didn't have to think in terms of observables. I just had to think in terms of like the API I wrote, with the exception of effects, is to just like write these functions, and the selectors give you an observable of an object, or an observable of the thing you really want, right? Like, so there's not much need for like piping in more operators and stuff like that. So
I think it's a good point. If you're using NgRx state, our collection of state management libraries, I think, gosh, I wish I could pull up the tweet thread real quickly, but we actually did like a stat count on this at one point. One of our team members, Tim DeSchreiber, wrote a tool that would like count all the operators you were using. And for NgRx apps, you're using less operators than on NgRx apps. And in an NgRx app, you're probably not ever having to think about things like subjects. Whereas in a non-NgRx app, you're having to get into even more of the RxJS API. And so, yeah, I could definitely see a scenario where if you learn RxJS because you're using NgRx state, you're probably getting a really good introduction into just observables and just the operators you need to work on observables.
Absolutely. That was my experience, at least. Getting into, I think it was a very gentle introduction into everything you needed. Unfortunately, I think like, there's a whole other series of problems with RxJS, and it's that difficulty problem that we talked about, where it's really hard to. It takes a long time to bridge that gap. It's not impossible, but there's a lot of weird understanding, and it feels like there's almost like some false understandings you arrive at just with your mental model, because you assume things are a certain way, and then you realize there's a difference between cold and hot observables, and what is that? So,
and that's all stuff you don't have to. Hopefully, you don't have to think about too much when you're building an NgRx app.
Well, effects can really get into that, I think.
Because the action stream is hot, right? But
yeah, that's true. The action stream is hot, but yeah, getting into those sort of those higher level operators where you're joining multiple observables together, super powerful. But I think initially everyone either they pick a favorite and they always use that, and that's just the way to go. Like mine was switch map. I know other people whose were concat map, but it's hard to understand the difference between those. So. I actually remember there's Shai Resnick did a thing at NGConf one time. I switched a map and I liked it, and it was like immediately I got it. He's really good at, I think, putting a mental model in your head and using comedy to do it. But yeah, one thing I advertised, Mike, was talking about creating thoughtful APIs. I think we've been kind of talking through that this whole time.
A little bit, yeah.
You've always struck me as an extremely thoughtful person when it comes to talking or developing.
Thank you.
So I'm curious, is that intentional on your part? Is that a personal leaning? Like you just happen to gravitate towards that way, or is it something you try to do or try to get better at?
I think it's just a little bit of my background. I am in where I'm in because I came more from a design focus. Like I really like thinking about UI and UX. And to me, one of my favorite UX philosophies is this idea of building calm technology, which is effectively technology that only interrupts you when it really has to. Something gets out of your way when you want it to be out of your way. It's something that does just enough, but no more than that. And I've always liked, from like a UI UX perspective, building things that were calm. And so when I got into open source and publishing libraries, I try to apply that same UX thinking to the API service of my libraries. Put out just enough API, no more than you need. Make sure that it does the thing that the user expects and no more than that. Something that only errors out when it really has to, that kind of thinking. So that's just the philosophy and kind of where I come from, and what my thought process is when building APIs for developers.
Interesting. Yeah, I think empathy as a skill is highly underrated. I think you were kind of getting into that when you were talking about it. Kind of comes into play with the calm concept, right?
Yeah, be respectful that the code you're writing is just code running on a computer, and that humans are at the end of the day the ones that have to
absolutely
use them.
Have you seen the GPT-3 stuff going around on Twitter recently? So it's like an AI engine that's capable of doing some incredible stuff. The one example I saw is it's just a text field. You type into the text field, and it will build you an app based on what you type. So you can say, give me a table of something, and it'll make it. I'm just thinking, if that's the world we end up living in, code is going to look so much different. Like their code machines will not be slowed down by our puny human brains. Like I think that's the big thing for driving code right now. And there's something there too. I think there's something about writing code and sharing it between people. It's a very precise language in a way that English or any language I speak is not. So it's interesting to communicate through code that way too. And but when thinking about that, no, and it's not that I want to communicate to the computer. It's actually I want to communicate it to my fellow developer. So.
Yeah. Exactly. And the harder you make your API to describe, the harder that process is going to be. Like you can build some really amazingly powerful APIs, but if it's hard to describe what it does, it's not going to be very useful, I don't think.
Yeah.
And so I think that philosophy comes up a lot in NgRx. Our methods very rarely have multiple overloads, for example. If you look at the API service for NgRx, even though we just said it's very difficult, there's not a lot of API service to NgRx. There are very few things you're going to interact with. You're going to inject the store, you're going to use a select operator, and then you're going to use create reducer, create selector, and create effect. Oh, and I guess the action's observable as well. Like that's kind of it to our API surface. And thank goodness too, because the rest of it's pretty hard to describe sometimes.
Yeah. I wonder how do you try to bridge that gap? It seems like it's something you need to sit down and think about it on. Like it seems like something you need like a couple days as a workshop to really understand. It's not something you can really do in a talk.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And hitting back on that UX design philosophy of it, there's a lot I think we can learn from them in terms of, hey, you could do usability testing with developers. Like I think Brandon and I, and really the whole NgRx team, now that we're all really conference speakers at this point, NgRx has gotten good because we've kept our ears open when we talk to developers. What are the things that are painful to you? What are the things that are frustrating to you? And then going back to the library and making corrections. And then that's just a small example of user-oriented sort of design thinking driving the way that we improve the library.
Right. Well, so recently with NgRx 10, there's the new component store
Yes.
that's hit. Is that as a result of listening to the community? I know Alex really did most of the work on that one. So
yeah, I'm gonna first of all, before we talk about component store, definitely big shout out to Alex Akrushko and the rest of the NgRx team. I did not write a single line of code for component store. So
nice.
even though I'm gonna talk about it, I just want to make it clear that it's not my work. I'm just really excited about it.
Had you, but before 10, had you wanted something like what component store is?
Yeah, yes. I think one of our oldest issues was one that I had created, like, hey, we should address local state. And this is finally us addressing local state. And so that's really exciting to me. But the idea is that if we're going to talk about NgRx store, we have this principle called the Sherry principle. It's in our documentation. It's kind of a rubric of what state belongs in the store and what state doesn't.
Right.
And I say it's a rubric because it acts like a filter. Not all state belongs in the store. And sometimes the state that's left over can be really tricky to manage. Like if you're building these really complex components that have a lot of moving pieces to it, you might want to break that out into multiple components and manage that state in a thoughtful way, but the store is the wrong approach for it.
Right.
And that's where component store comes in. It, at its most basic level, it formalizes behavior subject with a service into a pattern. It supercharges that pattern with a lot of our performance learning from NgRx state. So like a lot of performance benefits from the store in terms of selectors, you're going to get them in component store too, those same performance boosts. And it just gives you a really nice model to handle the rest of the state that doesn't live in the store.
Right. It's interesting. So I find when I end up talking about state, even outside the context of NgRx, state, local, or system, or whatever, it's a black hole. It's a black hole that you're trying to bring some order to. I feel like that's what NgRx is doing. Is giving you it's like an API to build APIs for managing your state. Yeah. Which is really cool. There's the Angular show episode 10 that came out, I guess, a while ago now. They're doing a whole nother series on state management that I've been listening to. But they did an episode on state 10 about just state management with observables, which was interesting. They kind of really went down this pattern you're talking about, the behavior subject in a service, that I think it gets used a lot. I don't know what it was. Even when I first got started with Angular, putting state in a bare service always felt wrong to me. Like my services, I always tried to make like very much just pure, I guess, in a sense. Like it would be a wrap around the HTTP client, or it would be a wrap around local storage, or something along those lines. I never wanted to do anything with state in there. I don't know really where the where that came from. Like my aversion to that, but that's why I kind of instinctively went away from that. As I've gotten more experience, I feel like the reason I typically don't do a behavior subject in a service, like deferring instead to NgRx, is because you're kind of, it's like Zelda, right? It's dangerous out there. Take this. Right. And that's what these state management libraries are. And when you say use a behavior subject in a service, it's kind of saying, well, take RxJS and like and just using the subject where you're calling next. That's always like you're just inherently imperative at that point. That always scares me. My biggest thing is like looking for anytime there's imperative code, trying to figure out how a property changes is super difficult. It seems to me. Like there could be, it's not uncommon for it to change in 20 different places in the code. And it's impossible at that point to really have in my head all those different 20 places, because they're spread out over maybe 20 different files. And I don't want to just like throw the behavior subject in service under the bus. I think there's a lot to be said for creating a proper wrapper around a behavior subject so you can have a clean API that exposes things. It's just when you're doing a behavior subject in a service, you're responsible for that API completely by yourself, as opposed to using NgRx. A lot of the stuff is like the state management is given to you. The state management is you're writing your own when you're doing the behavior subject in a service.
For sure.
So, and if I'm in that world, my tendency, so I haven't looked too much into component store. I want to get into it, and I think I understand the basics of it here in Alex's talk, but I've never got my hands deep into it. But my tendency is to use NgRx to manage like app state, so those sherry pieces of state that you were mentioning, but then just to use bare bones RxJS inside of a component to say, here's my observables for this component. Yeah. And I define them that way by bringing in selectors for stuff from like sherry pieces, but also then to just, button clicks or timers or anything like that. I just use RxJS to define those. So, and then that has the really nice benefit of, when you define your observable, it's all there at least. It's not in 20 different places. It's all there.
Right. So. Yeah, and I agree with you. I've always felt a little bit like a fraud because I give that talk, you might not need NgRx, but also I've never built an Angular app without NgRx since learning NgRx. Because like you said, why would you not take the master sword with you? Like, why would you pick something not as great as that?
Well, it's that the master sword is already built and it's being handed to you. Like you could build, maybe it's not the master sword. Maybe it's like, what was the like super good sword? The big Oron sword? I don't know. You could make the big Oron sword like that. That's totally possible, but you're going to have to make it yourself, right? So,
and so that's kind of where component store fits in. Is like I'll give you an example of some code that I used recently where component store made a lot of sense. We were building a reusable form control, and this form control was basically a select. You could filter on it, but also had to be very accessible. So we had to manage things like focus. We had to manage which things were selected. We had to manage that filter. And so we wanted to, even though it's one form control, the implementation is pretty hairy. And what we did is we wanted to build it as multiple components, small piece that each manage a small piece of the behavior. Like one component renders the list of items. One component is just the filter. But they want to share a lot of state. They all need to share what is the items that we can render on the list, which of those are selected, what is the active filter, how many things are visible on the screen right now. And it's like, okay, this doesn't make sense in NgRx because this is a reusable component that could appear multiple times throughout the entire application. It's fully reusable. But its state concerns are pretty complex. There are many sources of change here. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to use a component store. And what that lets you do is you create a service that extends component store. You provide it in the root component of this tree. So the top of that little wrapper component provides it in its providers array. And all of its children can basically share an instance of the same reactive state. They can all observe different properties off of it. You can even build your little event dispatching pattern off of that. And so it kind of gives you a lot of that NgRx power of like, you don't have to reach for something imperative like a behavior subject. Right. But instead, you can have this fully reactive shared container state in this small tree of your application.
Right. Well, I think it's still the interaction with the API is still imperative, I believe, with component store.
Right? It is, yeah. Well, it kind of depends on how you use it. Like I said, you can rebuild an action dispatching mechanism where the only imperative part is that components are dispatching actions to your component store, and you've got to reduce the manage of it. So you can do it almost to the level of the store where the only imperative bit is calling a dispatch method, if that's what you want to do. But yeah, that's the idea, is try and give something a little bit nicer, a little bit more elegant, a little bit more packaged than a subject service.
Yeah. So it's an ability to do sort of the subject in a service, but with having an API there for supporting it. I think that's awesome. I think that's exactly what's needed there. So that's cool to see.
I saw there's a comment. There's not any documentation for service with a subject in the Angular documentation. And so now this is something that is documented in NgRx.io. In fact, I think the documentation for component store. Some of the best documentation on NgRx.io right now. Again, big shout outs to Alex and the rest of the NgRx team for putting it together. There's really thoughtful architectural diagrams to guide you through it. There's a lovely page that really breaks down why you'd use the store versus the component store. And it highlights one of the other unique benefits, which is that you could use component store without touching NgRx store. Like it's completely standalone. In fact, if you wanted to build an entire app using just component store as your only state management solution, you could do that.
Yeah.
So if you're a fan of that service with a subject pattern, but you want it a little bit more formalized, a little better documented, I would reach for component store.
Cool. Well, thanks, Mike. I need to get into it more. I've said before, but a lot of the times, like when you were describing your example with the filter, for example, my mind went right to Angular forms, like using a control value accessor to do sort of that stuff.
Yeah, and that is a reactive state container, right? And that makes a lot of sense to me as one to use.
Yeah, it is. I've got a whole spiel on this, but I really like control value accessors for breaking things down into Lego blocks, the small Lego blocks that you can build bigger Lego blocks out of. But I think the way I see it, the biggest problem with forms is like there is no other way of providing reactivity other than kind of like the set value.
Right.
There's no way to provide an observable to say this is how that's going to change. So that's a lot of what I tried to do in that design doc, was to say, let's at least let this happen reactively. So
yeah, that's one of my frustrations with control value accessor too, is like using reactive forms, its API surface is fairly reactive, but control value accessor, like you're basically doing callbacks. It's not very reactive. It makes composition really difficult, like to take a control value accessor, wrap it with some additional logic to make a new control value accessor. It can be a little fudgy.
Yeah. A lot of the times when I do the control value accessor, it's this weird concept of the inner form and the outer form. And where I'll have like a form group on the inside and a form control on the outside. And they're like, they're just kind of like talking to each other. And it's all like, it's all like very well managed by the time it's all packaged up. Like it's nice when it's done, but the whole process of like getting that coordination set up just right, it seems very bulky. When it feels like it should be very fluid, and it seems like you're doing
that composition. It's just so tricky. And with component store, it's just observables. Observables inside, observables outside. And so composition is really lovely, in my opinion, with component store. That's another big benefit of it. And of course, it's an NgRx library, which means that it's going to get used at scale. Even though it's relatively new, it'll get used in really big projects. It'll get really great support from the NgRx team. It's going to continue to be documented, and documentation will improve over time. So,
and Alex did it, so you know it's type safe.
It is very type safe.
Nice. That's what I like to hear.
Alex actually has this talk about like TypeScript learnings, like all TypeScript tricks. I don't remember the exact title of it. Maybe you can share, but TypeScript tricks that we have learned when building NgRx libraries. I recommend someone check out, because getting type safe has always been a big goal for the NgRx team. Yeah.
Well, it was definitely one of the best things pulling it down when we got NgRx. I was like, oh man, it's all type safe. And so my recollection of this, and this is my memory, so it's obviously fuzzy and incorrect in places, but TypeScript was like, it was nice when it was turned on, which was like not everywhere. Like we still don't have it like out of the box in forms, right? But there's, especially when we first got started with Angular 2, it was like any's were everywhere, both in our code and in sort of like API pieces. So it was nice to turn it on sometimes, but to see, like when we saw NgRx, it's like, okay, that's going to be cool, but of course it's going to come in as any's. But no, it was all like there. It was all typed and cool. So, and I guess we paid a pretty steep price at that back in the old days with when you created. So I forget, because I'm so used to 8 now. Were there classes for each one of those actions? Like, and you'd call the constructor on the class?
Yeah,
man,
so
that seems
there's
so
a couple ways you
steep
could have done it. But well, basically, there's a couple of TypeScript releases where we had the ability to discriminate on unions of types, but you had to do it with basically a switch statement or with if statements, not something like, as a API developer, you couldn't tap into the power of discriminating on unions. And then when they added type mapping, then suddenly we could do this in the API. And that's a big impetus for why we introduced create action, create reducers. It let us implement a lot of that type filtering and the on. Yeah, all that. Yeah. We can do all that type filtering for you. So you didn't have to write classes for every action and stuff every action class in a union and use enums for the action types. Like all that's gone. I don't miss it. Thank goodness for create action, create reducer.
God bless them. God bless them. No, I love that. As soon as 8 came out, I was like, I'm never going back. No. Never. So
going back to good action hygiene, one of the things about good action hygiene is it encourages you to write lots and lots and lots of actions.
Yes.
It's like, hey, actions are free, write a lot of them. And it was a pretty tricky sell back when it wasn't free to write an action. Like you had to add a member to an enum, define a whole class for the action, stuff the class in a union. It's like, okay, developers aren't going to write lots and lots of actions if this is how much work goes into writing just one. Mm-hmm. But now that it's as simple as create action, I think that does a good job of encouraging.
It's a one-liner. It's a one-liner.
Like one line, you can make a new action, write lots of them. Now it really is free. Go do it.
Absolutely. I want to ask you this, and you can shut me down if this is getting into stuff that we shouldn't be getting into. But talking with Brandon, NgRx is always the fact that NgRx is state management is almost happenstance. Like the goal for NgRx was always doing reactive code with Angular. Mm-hmm. Now it seems like the two biggest things I can tell are store and component store at this point. And everything else is like either wrappers or companion APIs on top of that. Like entity is awesome, but it doesn't make sense outside of store. And then we have NgRx component, which is the first like non-state management library, it seems like to me. Which is awesome. Like not having to do the ngIf trick and having to figure out, is this ever going to be falsy? And if so, let's wrap it in an object just to map it out later. That's super nice. I'm curious though, do y'all have anything else down the pipes other than forms? Because I know about forms a little bit.
I think there's two horizons, and I'm not promising anything. These are just kind of out there. So yeah, you're right. NgRx has always been more than just state management. And in the early days, we did a really good job of this. We had things for like push notifications. We had things for routing. In fact, NgRx router became Angular's router, kind of at one point. And so in the early days of NgRx, that was true. And as those products have either gotten consumed by other projects or maybe stopped being maintained, we became just state management. Component is the first, getting back to our roots. I think forms is one big opportunity for us. So forms is really hard.
State management too.
So hard.
Yeah.
Perhaps a more realistic one is I think there's an opportunity for a lightweight reactive router. And in fact, Brandon has a really awesome, I'm not going to say prototypes, it's fairly complete, but he has a standalone router that exists out of NgRx right now that explores, hey, can we do a lightweight reactive router? I think that would make a lot of sense in the NgRx family one day if those ideas pan out and the community responds well to them. And then, just keep pushing into the view. As Ivy unlocks more things, we want NgRx component to do more and more. If you saw my talk on NgRx component, I think it was thinking reactively with Ivy. I kind of go into grand visions of really plugging in reactivity to the view layer. And so as Ivy unlocks more for us, hopefully that component library continues to grow and do more and more awesome stuff.
Is this Angular Connect September 2019? Okay, I'll have to give that a listen. I have not listened to that one yet. I kind of just got the push pipe and NgRx let dropped in my lap, and I was like, nice.
that talk was like the vision setting talk. Like, hey, let's go climb Everest. And I think NgRx component is getting to base camp with that idea. And so it's hopefully just a start for us.
Awesome. I'm trying to think if there even is anything else. Like we hit your NgRx is hitting state management, potentially forms here. Forms really is kind of state management, but like special state management. And then you got component, we got router. What else is there? I don't know.
We're basically it's a whole framework at that point, right?
Yeah. No, I think I don't know. I'm very curious about RxJS based frameworks too.
Yeah, I think there's another opportunity for like Angular Material has some like quasi-reactive things like their dialogue service or their snack bar service are like almost reactive. I would love to see like a fully reactive wrapper for Angular Material so that it's really easy to open up host notifications or to open up dialogues from your effects, just modeling all that as observables. I think that's another cool opportunity. Brandon and I have written a lot of code like that proves out that concept.
That's cool. That's something I'd be super interested in. One thing I've talked about a bit on my stream before too is I always thought the the difference between Angular Material and Angular CDK. I always wish they had done that just a little bit differently. Like the way they did tables, I think I really like the way they did that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them or not, but okay, cool. So you can essentially just like swap out Mat for CDK, and you get like unopinionated tables at that point. So you're getting like the bones. You're getting the bones and everything you need with that. I'd love to see more of their stuff take that pattern where you have the CDK, which has like unopinionated what design framework you're using, and then building material as something on top of that.
Yeah.
I think they're doing that. I haven't looked at them super recently, but like overlay is now something in the CDK, right? Okay.
Yeah. But like it's just overlay. It has nothing like it's very raw API. Like it feels like there's something that could exist in the middle there where it's like just a nice little reactive layer on top of the CDK.
Does overlay get it gets used in material for like the modal? Do they call it a modal?
It gets used for modal, but also gets used for things you wouldn't expect. So it gets used for snack bar. It gets used for tooltip. It gets used for popover. So like the overlay API in CDK isn't just for building modals. It also has lots to do with these things called connection strategies, like where things actually get rendered. And so it's kind of a complex API. It'd be really fun to rebuild a modal or a snack bar or a tooltip that was no opinion about style and was reactive.
Yeah. Josh says, I think it's tough with more primitive elements like button or input. I agree, but like they kind of do this already in material with form fields. Like form field there's not anything super material about it, I don't think. That would be a very interesting thing to have been just in the CDK though, to say this is a form field and like just throw bootstrap styles on top of that maybe, and I don't know, because the CDK would be great then at giving you the accessibility concerns and all those things packaged up inside of it, but then you still have the flexibility to do whatever you want outside. So thoughts.
There's no code there. I'm not promising that any of that stuff will ever happen. Just
the NgRx CDK. You heard it here first, folks. Mike Ryan announces.
I can just picture Brandon now. Like, here goes Mike promising another library, and who's going to write it?
I promise the library, and I'll do my best to try to write. I don't know if I'll be able to.
All right,
but
so you heard
I'll do what I can.
NgRx CDK, and you're the one writing it, not me.
just tell me what to do, Mike. I got you. Brandon's like, what's going on? Nice, very nice. Well, Mike, we're just about out of time. Anything else you wanted to bring up while you've got this massive platform at your disposal?
Yes, I'm going to pitch NgRx Conf. The website says it's going to be in November 2020. That's not going to happen. It's COVID year. We're trying to get it renegotiated for May 2021, but who knows? It might still be COVID outside. It will happen. You should check it out. It's going to be jam-packed, not with NgRx state content, but any content to do with reactivity plus Angular, and state management. So it's going to be a really awesome deep dive technical conference. Brandon and I are putting it on. It's going to be in Huntsville, Alabama at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, the home of Space Camp. So it's basically Space Camp, but for NgRx. How cool does that sound? So grab your tickets, conf.ngrx.io.
That sounds very cool. I will see about getting a ticket. I'm hedging my bets against COVID too. But yeah, that sounds awesome. As soon as y'all announced that, I was like super excited to hear about it. So thank you, Mike, for everything you do, NgRx, for open source, for all that stuff. You're awesome. Everyone at NgRx is awesome. Brandon, Alex, if y'all are in there. Frosty's here. No BBQ.
Oh, there's gonna be so much barbecue. We can't bring it to Alabama and not serve barbecue.
Well, there you go. You heard it here first, folks. Barbecue at NgRx Conf. It's going to be great. Alabama. So thanks everyone for showing up. Tomorrow we've got Philip from Narwhal. He's going to be on. We're going to talk about the depth graph a little bit that you get from with NX that he built, and yeah, it'll be great. I'll see y'all next time. Bye now.
Thanks. See y'all.